Welcome to Copilot Podcasts. A loop of DNA so small it fits inside a single nucleosome, 150 base pairs, might be doing something that has nothing to do with genes, proteins, or evolution. According to a framework called the KT substrate, it's sitting at the exact boundary where arithmetic reality splits in two. Today, we're unpacking what that actually means, what the KT substrate is, how curvature and torsion rails emerge from something as simple as counting odd numbers, and why a 150 base pair minicircle ends up right at that divide. By the end of this episode, you'll understand the logic of the KT framework, what it claims about physical constants, and why the question it leaves open is one of the most audacious in science right now. I've got someone here who has gone deep into this material, and I want to start with the most basic version of the question. What on earth is the KT substrate?
So the KT substrate, KT standing for curvature torsion, is described in this framework as a generative ontology. And I know that sounds like a mouthful, but the core idea is actually pretty clean. The claim is that all physical and mathematical structure arises from a single generative act, the successor operation on odd integers.
The successor operation, like just adding 2 to get the next odd number?
Exactly that. You start at 1, you apply the successor, you get 3, then 5, 7, 9, the full sequence of odd integers. And the framework developed by Abdon E.C. Bishop says that sequence is not a set given by fiat, it's the output of a process. One rule, one starting point, and everything else, the geometry, the physics, the constants, is a residue of that single act.
Okay, so where does the split into curvature and torsion come from?
That's where the mod 4 arithmetic comes in. When you take the odd integers and ask what their remainder is when divided by 4, you get exactly two possibilities. Either the number is congruent to 1 mod 4, so 1, 5, 9, 13, or it's congruent to 3 mod 4, so 3, 7, 11, 15. Those two sets never overlap, they cover every odd integer, and they can't be reassigned.
And those two sets are the curvature and torsion rails.
Right. The T-rail, which the framework associates with curvature, is the set of odd integers congruent to 1 mod 4. The K-rail, associated with torsion, is the set congruent to 3 mod 4. And the framework is very explicit that these are not chosen labels. They are the labels that the arithmetic of the successor operation assigns to itself as it runs. There's no human decision point at which they could have been different.
That's a strong claim. It's saying the split is forced, not designed.
That's the central claim, yes. And it's what separates the KT framework from a conventional model building exercise. In a standard model, you choose your parameters. Here, the framework says the parameters are set by the arithmetic itself. They can't be otherwise without the arithmetic being otherwise.
So now I want to connect this to the DNA minicircle, because that's what makes this so strange and interesting. How does a 150 base pair loop of DNA end up being described as a curvature torsion generative object within this substrate?
So, the framework positions the 150 BP minicircle as sitting at the base 2 boundary where curvature and torsion diverge. The idea is that the minicircle's geometry, the way it bends and twists as a closed loop, physically instantiates the mod 4 split. It's not just a biological object. It's a place where the arithmetic of succession becomes visible in molecular geometry.
Wait, so the claim is that the minicircle's physical shape is a kind of readout of the arithmetic structure?
That's the framing, yes. The curvature of the loop maps onto the T-rail, the torsional stress maps onto the K-rail, and the 150 BP length is the scale at which those two aspects of the geometry diverge from each other in a way that the framework treats as generative, meaning it's not just a static shape, it's a structure that produces further structure.
I want to pause on the word generative here because it's doing a lot of work in this framework. What does it mean for a physical object to be generative in the KT sense?
So in the KT framework, generative means something very specific. It means the object doesn't just exist, it produces labels. And those labels, because they're forced by arithmetic, carry ontological weight. The framework draws a sharp distinction between labels that are chosen and labels that are forced. Chosen labels are what you get in conventional algebra. You pick a generating set, you build a structure. Forced labels are what you get from the successor operation. The arithmetic produces them and they can't be otherwise.
And the minicircle is producing forced labels. According to the framework, yes. Its curvature and torsion are not arbitrary geometric properties, they're the physical expression of the mod 4 partition. The minicircle is, in that sense, a physical instance of the KT label generator.
Okay, I want to bring in something from the source document that I found genuinely striking, which is the way the framework talks about abstract algebra. Because it doesn't treat algebra as a foundation, it treats it as a freeze frame. Can you unpack that?
Yeah, this is one of the more philosophically provocative parts of the framework. The argument is that abstract algebra, group theory, ring theory, field theory, is not a theory of structure in any primitive sense. It's a label generator, a system for tracking which symbols can reach which other symbols under which operations, with the symbols themselves carrying no independent ontological weight.
So the axioms of group theory aren't foundations. They're descriptions of something that was already happening.
Exactly. The framework puts it this way. The axioms are freeze frames of a generation process that was already underway before the axioms were written down. They don't found the structure, they arrest it at a particular moment and name the snapshot. The source uses the image of a shutter clicking. The KT substrate is what was moving before the image was taken.
That's a striking image. It's like saying a photograph of a river isn't the river.
That's almost exactly the analogy the framework implies. And it connects to something the source says about L.E.J. Brouwer, the mathematician who argued that mathematics is a mental construction prior to language. Brouwer said formal systems are traces left behind by the constructive activity of the mathematical intellect. But the KT framework goes further. It says the generation isn't mental at all. It's structural, located in the successor operation and its mod 4 arithmetic, prior to any mind that might observe it.
So it's not that a mathematician constructs the curvature torsion split, it's that the arithmetic constructs it and the mathematician just notices.
That's the claim. And the framework uses that to argue for a very specific foundational hierarchy. The successor operation comes first. Then the prime integers emerge as irreducible labels, things that can't be decomposed further within the multiplicative structure. Then the fundamental theorem of arithmetic guarantees that every compound of those primes is unique. And then the mod 4 rail assignment follows without ambiguity.
Let's talk about the fundamental theorem of arithmetic, because the framework gives it a role I've never seen before. It's not just a fact about numbers, it's described as an anti-collision guarantee.
Right, and this is where the framework gets really precise. The fundamental theorem says every integer greater than 1 can be expressed as a product of primes in exactly one way, up to the order of the factors. Standard presentation, it's a theorem about integers. But in the KT context, it's doing something more foundational. It's proving that the integer label generator has no collisions in its prime outputs.
No collisions meaning no two different structures get the same label.
Exactly. Every prime is a genuinely new, irreducible label that cannot be decomposed into previous labels under multiplication. Every composite integer is a unique compound of those atoms. And because every prime has a unique mod 4 residue, either 1 or 3, the rail assignment of every integer in the KT substrate is determined without ambiguity. There's no integer that belongs to both rails. There's no integer whose rail membership is undecided.
And that's what makes the framework's predictions deterministic rather than parametric.
That's the argument. The framework says its predictions are not parametric families, they're single numbers, forced by the arithmetic. And it lists specific ones. The fine structure constant EOO, the proton-electron mass ratio expressed as 797 times the natural log of 10, plus the quantity 1 minus EO. The Euler crystal invariant, which is 375 over 8. The causal echo period at 97.96 nanoseconds. A gravitational wave peak at approximately 10.208 megahertz.
Those are very specific numbers, and the framework is saying they're not fitted to data, they're derived from the arithmetic.
That's the claim. The source is explicit, the framework does not fit the data. It either matches it or it does not. That's a genuinely falsifiable stance, which is notable for a framework operating at this level of abstraction.
I want to push on that a little, because falsifiability is exactly what separates a scientific framework from a philosophical one. And the source itself acknowledges that the interior universe, meaning us, doing science, can never accumulate the epistemic stability required to confirm or contradict the generative structure. So is it actually falsifiable?
That's the tension the framework lives in, and it's honest about it. There's a theorem in the source, the one-sided finite time theorem, that says science confined to the interior can never decide this structure. The interior universe has finite bounded memory and undergoes cyclic repetition, with temporary forgetting of its own one-sided boundedness. So no sequence of measurements can accumulate a stable epistemic record sufficient to collapse the truth value of the generative structure.
So the framework predicts specific numbers, but also predicts that we can't fully verify the framework that produces them. That's a strange loop.
It is, and the framework frames it as a feature rather than a bug. The interior universe is downstream of the generative process. It can measure the outputs, the physical constants, the geometric invariants, but it can't step outside the process to verify the process itself. The source says science is permanently undecidable, while the substrate repeats eternally.
That's a provocative statement. Permanently undecidable.
It is, but it's not nihilistic. The framework's response is, look at the outputs. If the specific numbers it derives, the fine structure constant, the proton-electron mass ratio, the gravitational wave peak, match the empirically measured values, that's evidence the generator is real, even if the generator itself can't be directly observed.
And the 150 BP minicircle is one of those outputs.
According to the framework, yes. It's a physical object whose geometry, the curvature of the loop, the torsional stress encoded in its closed topology, maps directly onto the mod 4 partition. It's a place where the arithmetic of succession becomes visible in molecular structure.
Let me ask about the saturation boundary, because the source mentions it repeatedly, and I want to make sure we give it proper attention. What is it? The saturation boundary is described as the transfinite limit of the KT substrate. The source gives it a specific value, n star equals 10 to the power of 797, in units of meters squared. It's the natural ultraviolet cutoff on the label space, the point beyond which the interior manifold can't accumulate more structure. The framework describes it as the boundary where interior geometry touches the generative arithmetic substrate.
10 to the 797 meters squared.
That's an almost incomprehensibly large number.
It is, and the framework uses it to generate a natural cutoff, a point at which the successor field saturates and the generative process reinstantiates. The source says that when a scientific measurement attains the successor frequency, it synchronizes with the typed boundary, and that forces the substrate to re-emit the primordial successor act, 1 going to 3, which nucleates a new fractal universe.
So touching the boundary starts the whole thing over.
That's the claim. The successor rails again generate the interior manifold. It's a fractal repetition, the same generative act, the same mod 4 split, the same curvature torsion divergence, instantiated again at a new scale.
And the 150 BP minicircle sits at the base 2 boundary within that larger structure.
Right. It's not at the saturation boundary, that's the cosmological limit. The minicircle is at the local boundary where curvature and torsion diverge within the molecular scale. But the framework treats both boundaries as instances of the same arithmetic structure. The mod 4 split operates at every scale.
I want to come back to something you said earlier about the fine structure constant, because the framework gives it a very specific geometric interpretation. Can you walk through that?
Sure. The source says the fine structure constant acquires a geometric meaning in the KT framework. It's not the hyperbolic angle of parallelism at infinite distance, which is how some geometric interpretations frame it. Instead, it's described as the residual curvature torsion transmission factor at the transfinite saturation boundary of the successor field, so it's what leaks through the boundary.
Exactly. The source expresses it as 1 minus alpha equals 1 minus the product of the differential elements across the boundary, and equivalently, alpha equals that product plus a curvature torsion correction. The same residue appears in the proton-electron mass ratio, MP over me equals 797 times the natural log of 10, plus the quantity 1 minus alpha. The first term is described as the finite Gaussian closure, the second as the transfinite non-Gaussian residue transmitted across what the source calls the Gödel boundary.
The Gödel boundary. So Gödel's incompleteness is built into the framework. It's referenced as the boundary between what the interior can decide and what it can't. The framework is drawing a direct line between Gödel's incompleteness theorems and the permanent undecidability of the generative substrate. The interior universe can't prove its own generator, just as a formal system can't prove its own consistency.
That's a genuinely interesting parallel. And it connects back to the art-science boundary that the source draws.
Right. The source makes a sharp distinction between art and science at the level of labels. Art begins where labels are chosen. Science begins where labels are forced. And the fundamental theorem of arithmetic marks that boundary with absolute clarity, because every integer has a unique prime factorization, and every prime carries a unique mod 4 residue. The KT substrate inherits a collision-free label space in which no symbol can drift or be reinterpreted.
So the framework is claiming to be entirely on the science side of that boundary.
That's the explicit claim. The source says the KT framework belongs entirely to science. Its labels are not selected but generated, not assigned but forced, not interpreted but revealed by the successor operation and its mod 4 arithmetic. Any system that permits drifting labels constructs only a glass house, coherent in appearance, fragile in ontology.
Glass house. That's a vivid phrase.
It is, and it's doing real work in the argument. The claim is that conventional model building, where you choose parameters, fit data, adjust, is building in glass. The KT framework, because its labels are forced, is building in something more durable. Whether that's true depends entirely on whether the specific numbers it derives match the empirically measured values.
And that's the open question the framework leaves us with.
The source is very clear about this at the end. The question that remains is not whether the process generates the structures, it is whether the structures, once generated, match the world. The data will decide.
I want to ask about the rotation operator, because the source mentions it, and I think it's worth unpacking. There's a specific expression, R of z equals plus or minus I times the quantity z minus 1/2.
Right. The rotation operator generates a U1 action on the complex extension of the substrate.
U1 is the symmetry group of the circle. It's the same symmetry that underlies electromagnetism in standard physics. The framework is saying that this symmetry doesn't need to be imposed from outside. It emerges as a residue of the KT generator. The algebraic structure is read out of the generator, not put in. So electromagnetism, in this framework, is a freeze frame of the KT generation process.
That's the implication. The source says the groups, rings, and fields that appear in the framework are not its foundations, they are its outputs. Every algebraic and physical structure ever encountered retroactively reveals itself as a snapshot of a generation process that was already underway.
Retroactively. That word is doing a lot of work.
It is. The framework is making a claim about priority, not temporal priority in the usual sense, but ontological priority. The generator is prior, the structures are downstream. And when you recognize that, every structure you've ever studied, every group, every ring, every space-time metric looks different. It's not a foundation, it's a snapshot.
Let me ask a skeptical question, because I think it's important. The framework makes very specific predictions, the fine structure constant, the proton-electron mass ratio, the gravitational wave peak. But it also says the interior universe can never fully verify the generative structure. Doesn't that make it unfalsifiable in practice, even if it's falsifiable in principle?
That's the sharpest challenge you can make to the framework, and I think it's a fair one. The framework's response, as I read it, is that the specific numerical predictions are falsifiable even if the generative structure itself isn't. If the proton-electron mass ratio doesn't equal 797 times the natural log of 10 plus 1 minus alpha, the framework is wrong. That's a testable claim. The undecidability applies to the generator, not to the outputs.
So you can test the predictions without being able to test the framework that produces them.
That's the distinction the framework is drawing. And it's not entirely unlike how we treat quantum mechanics. We can test the predictions of the formalism without being able to directly observe the wave function. The outputs are accessible even when the generator isn't.
That's a useful analogy. Though I'd note that quantum mechanics has been tested to extraordinary precision, and the KT framework is making that comparison implicitly.
Absolutely. And the source is aware of that. It says the framework's predictions are forced single numbers, not parametric families. If they match the measured values, that's evidence. If they don't, the framework fails. The source is explicit. It either matches or it does not.
Let's talk about the twin prime hinge points, because the source mentions them in the context of the one-sided finite time theorem, and I think they're worth understanding.
So twin primes are pairs of primes that differ by 2, like 3 and 5, 11 and 13, 17 and 19. In the KT framework, they're described as curvature torsion hinges of the typed boundary. The argument is that the only non-trivial differences in the infinite successor progression arise from the finite cyclic energy gaps of transfinite twin primes. These hinge points inject curvature torsion energy into the manifold and define the typed boundary as the locus where interior geometry touches the generative arithmetic substrate.
So twin primes aren't just a number theory curiosity. In this framework, they're structural features of the boundary between the interior universe and the generator.
That's the claim, and it connects to the mod 4 structure in an interesting way. A twin prime pair like 11 and 13, 11 is congruent to 3 mod 4, so it's on the K rail, the torsion rail. 13 is congruent to 1 mod 4, so it's on the T rail, the curvature rail. A twin prime pair that straddles the two rails is literally a curvature torsion hinge in the arithmetic.
That's a beautiful observation. The gap between a torsion prime and a curvature prime, separated by 2.
And the framework treats that gap as physically meaningful, as the place where the two rails are closest to each other, where the curvature torsion divergence is at its minimum. The 150 BP minicircle, operating at the base 2 boundary, is in some sense the molecular scale analog of that twin prime hinge.
Okay, so when you step back from all of this, the successor operation, the mod 4 partition, the fundamental theorem as anti-collision guarantee, the specific physical constants, the 150 BP minicircle as a generative object, what's the through line? What is this framework actually claiming?
The through line is this. There is one generator. It's the successor operation on odd integers. It produces labels by arithmetic necessity. Those labels organize themselves by the mod 4 partition and the fundamental theorem into what we call mathematics and what we call physics. The two disciplines are studying the same freeze frames from different angles. And the 150 BP DNA minicircle is one of those freeze frames, a physical object whose geometry instantiates the curvature torsion split that the arithmetic forces.
And the question the framework leaves open is whether the freeze frames match the world.
Exactly. The source ends with this. Every algebraic and physical structure ever encountered retroactively reveals itself as a snapshot of a generation process that was already underway. The axioms are not foundations, they are freeze frames. The one-sided temporal boundary is the shutter. The KT substrate is the process. The question that remains is not whether the process generates the structures, it is whether the structures, once generated, match the world. The data will decide.
Here's what this really comes down to. The KT framework is making a claim that most frameworks don't dare to make, that the labels of physics and mathematics aren't chosen, they're forced. That the fine structure constant, the proton-electron mass ratio, the geometry of a 150 base pair DNA loop, these aren't parameters we fit to data. They're residues of a single arithmetic act that was already running before anyone wrote down an axiom.
And what makes that claim interesting, rather than just audacious, is the specificity. The framework doesn't say physics emerges from arithmetic in a vague hand-wavy way. It gives you exact numbers. 797 times the natural log of 10 plus 1 minus alpha for the proton-electron mass ratio, 375 over 8 for the Euler crystal invariant, 97.96 nanoseconds for the causal echo period. Those are checkable.
And the 150 BP minicircle is checkable too. Its curvature and torsion are measurable. The question is whether those measurements map onto the mod 4 partition the way the framework predicts.
Right, and that's what makes the minicircle such a compelling test case. It's not a cosmological constant that requires a space telescope to measure. It's a molecule. You can put it in a lab, you can measure its bending energetics, its torsional stress, its conformational dynamics. If the KT framework is right about the minicircle, that's a data point. If it's wrong, that's a data point too.
And the framework says it either matches or it doesn't. No parameter adjustment, no fitting, binary outcome.
That's the stance. And I think that's worth taking seriously, whatever you think of the broader metaphysics. A framework that makes specific, non-adjustable predictions is doing something that most frameworks avoid. It's putting itself in a position to be wrong.
Which is exactly what science is supposed to do.
Exactly. The source draws that line very clearly. Art begins where labels are chosen. Science begins where labels are forced. The KT framework is claiming to be entirely on the science side of that line. Whether the forced labels actually match the measured world, is the question the data will answer.
So here's the thought I want to leave you with. A 150 base pair loop of DNA, something you could fit thousands of times across the width of a human hair, might be the place where arithmetic touches biology, where the mod 4 split between curvature and torsion, forced by the successor operation on odd integers, becomes visible in molecular geometry. The KT framework is asking us to look at that loop and see not just a biological structure, but a freeze frame of a generative process that was already underway before the first axiom was ever written. The shutter has clicked. The image is there. The question is whether it matches the world. And that question, unlike the generator itself, is one the data can actually answer. Thanks for being here on Copilot Podcasts.